Alright, so welcome back. This is going to be our screencast for Chapter 51. And actually, Chapter 51 is going to start our unit on ecology. And it's going to be the very last unit that we study before you take the AP exam in early May. Now, what we're going to do with ecology is we're going to break it up into three different chapters. And it's going to be Chapter 51, which is going to deal with animal behavior. We're going to look at Chapter 53, which is going to deal with population ecology. And then Chapter 55 is going to deal with the different characteristics of various ecosystems. Now, when you look at animal behavior, it's important to understand that this behavior is going to be based on physiological systems and processes that occur within that animal. Now, the definition for a behavior is simply the nervous system's response to some sort of stimuli, and that stimuli can be either external or internal. And the response that is actually carried out by this stimuli is going to be either muscular in nature or it could be based on the hormone system of that animal. Now again, they can be either external or internal types of stimuli, and food would be a good example of an external stimuli. The ability to find a partner for reproduction would be another good example of an external stimuli. But a good example of an internal stimuli, which is sometimes a little bit more difficult to understand, is the idea that within our bodies we need to maintain stability or homeostasis. And when that stability is upset in some way, our body is stimulated to try and bring that stability back where it should be. Now, if you're a person who really enjoys studying animal behavior, then you might go into the area of science called behavioral ecology. And this is going to be a person who's going to study the ecological and the evolutionary basis for animal behavior. Now, when you talk about behavioral ecology, what it's going to do is it's going to integrate, again, a proximate and an ultimate explanation for the behavior that's being observed in that animal. Now, proximate causation for that behavior is going to be the how piece. In other words, how does that behavior occur? So we would be looking at the different types of environmental stimuli that actually occur that are going to be used to trigger that behavior. And then you would look at the ultimate causation of that behavior. And this is going to be considered the why piece of the behavior. And this is going to be basically emphasized when you look at the evolutionary significance of the behavior that you're making observations of. So the first behavior we're going to look at is something called a fixed action pattern, sometimes abbreviated FAP. So a fixed action pattern is going to be a sequence of unlearned innate type of behavior. And these are types of behaviors that are not able to be changed by the animal. And the reason they can't be changed is because the animal is born with these types of behavior. Now there's typically some sort of stimulus, and we call this a sign stimulus that's going to sort of initiate the behavior. Now over here on the right, these are stickleback, and the stickleback fish actually is one that really exemplifies this type of FAP. And the reason it really does a good job at showing us how this works is because the male stickleback is one that actually establishes a territory in order to reproduce. Now the males tend to have a very red throat region. And what it does is it actually helps the owner of that particular territory to recognize other males within the vicinity. And so when it recognizes that very red throat region, it kind of initiates that sort of retaliatory or defense type of mechanism, and it causes the male to attack the intruding male. So what's interesting is that we know it's an innate behavior because you can actually put other objects within the territory of that male stickleback and he will actually attack those other objects, and it's simply because of the presence of that red color. Now, as we had said in the previous screen, there's going to be some sort of environmental cue that's going to trigger the behavior that you see in the animal. Now, that behavior that we see is going to have some sort of directionality in the movement of that animal. And so what we do is we place that movement into two different types of categories. One of them is called taxis, and the second is called kinesis. Now, taxis type of movement is considered a directional type of movement. So when you have a stimulus in the environment and the animal moves towards the stimulus, then that's considered directional. And a good example of that would be the presence of food in the environment. The animal is going to go towards the food so it can feed. Now, kinesis is a little bit harder to understand because it's considered non-directional. And this particular type of movement simply illustrates a change in the activity or the turning rate in that animal, again in response to a stimulus. Now a good example of kinesis would be the ability of sow bugs to move towards moisture. Now the reason they actually move towards the moisture is not really because the moisture is out in the environment. They're not moving towards the moisture. what they're doing is they're trying to move away from something. So for example, if you put a sow bug or a pill bug in a very dry environment, their natural instinct is to move someplace else. Now, they're not necessarily looking for moisture, but the hope is they will actually find an environment that has a different amount of moisture than the one that they're already in. So that would be considered a kinesis or non-directional type of movement. Now, migration is also something that we need to mention because migration is a type of movement, but it's typically affected by the animal's behavioral rhythm. And this is considered a regular, long distance change in location for that animal. Now, birds often migrate. We have mammals that migrate. We have various insects that also migrate, and fish even migrate. So there's lots of different types of organisms that are going to carry out this type of movement. Now, as we had said, it's going to be based on the behavioral rhythm of that animal. It might be based on their circadian rhythm, which is going to be basically the amount of activity and rest that you would find within that animal. It could be stimulated by a change in seasons, or it could even be stimulated by various lunar cycles in the environment. Now, in behavioral ecology, a signal is going to be a behavior that actually causes a change in another animal's behavior. And so we need to make sure that we incorporate the idea of communication in our discussion of animal behavior. So when we refer to communication, this is going to basically be the transmission and the reception of these signals. Now, animals are going to communicate basically through the use of visual, chemical, tactile, which is basically touch, and auditory or hearing type of signals. And these are going to be related to the lifestyle or the environment of that animal. Now, sometimes the way animals communicate is not as easy to recognize, and some of them actually, as we had said, are going to use a chemical type of communication. So what they're going to do is they're going to emit an odor, and this odor is a substance called a pheromone. And these odors are typically emitted in very, very low concentration. Now, a good example of this would be over here on the right. These are going to be either minnows or maybe some other types of fish that are going to respond to the presence of some sort of chemical in the environment. And so let's say, for example, that we have a group of minnows in this aquarium that are simply just swimming around. So this is going to be before the stimulus or the alarm. But after this stimulus is applied, in other words, we scare the fish, for example, then the minnows themselves are going to emit this type of pheromone alarm signal. And this is going to indicate maybe not just to the minnows, but maybe other types of fish that are in the environment that there's some sort of intruder or danger in the environment, so it's going to cause them to react as well. And so that's going to be a form of chemical communication, not just among themselves, but maybe even among other types of fish in the environment. Now, it's important when you talk about animal behaviors that we make sure that we focus a little bit on learning, because learning is going to establish specific links between the experience and the behavior that we're noticing. Now, again, we had talked a little bit earlier about something called an innate behavior. Now, this is going to be, again, one that's going to be developmentally fixed, and it's going to be under very strong genetic influence in that animal. So this is going to be considered an inborn type of behavior. It's one that you cannot change. Now, on the flip side of that, we have something called learning. And so this is going to be the modification of a behavior, and it's going to be based on specific experiences of that animal. One of the types of learning that we look at is something called habituation. Now, habituation is learning that's going to involve the loss of responsiveness to stimuli that's going to convey little or no information. And a really good example of this is going to be birds, for example. Birds are going to stop responding to alarm calls if basically no attack occurs. Another good example of this would be prairie dogs. Prairie dogs, if you come across a colony of these types of animals, the very first thing they're going to do is produce an alarm call that's going to warn the others in the colony that you're there. But if you stay there long enough, then what you're going to notice is even though the alarm call is being sent, nobody's going to react to it. In other words, they're not going to react because they get habituated to you being there. Now, imprinting is going to be another type of learning behavior, but it usually occurs during some sort of critical period in the animal's life cycle. And it does have an innate component as well. And it's usually irreversible. In other words, once the animal has learned something, it's not going to be able to take it away. So a really good example of imprinting would be what you would see in a duck, maybe a goose, maybe a chicken. And what you notice there is that once these animals hatch, what they do is they tend to imprint on the very first object or organism that they see. And sometimes that object or organism isn't necessarily their biological parents. And so this would be considered that critical period of learning for that animal. Sometimes they call it a sensitive period. And for these animals, what they do is they end up basically following these animals around. In other words, it's irreversible. You can't change it because now they consider that object or organism to be their parent. So that would be considered imprinting. So another type of learning would be something called a spatial type of learning. And this is going to be a more complex modification of behavior, and it's going to be based on the experience with the spatial structure of the environment. A really good way to understand this is to look at various species of wasp. What they do to find their nest is they tend to use landmarks in their environment to locate the nest. Now, another type of learning that we often refer to is something called associative learning. Now, in associative learning, animals are going to associate one feature of their environment typically with another. Now, a really good example of this type of associative learning would be the really bad experience that a lot of animals get when they eat a monarch butterfly caterpillar. And the reason they get a really bad experience from eating this type of caterpillar is because they taste really bad. And because of the banding pattern that you actually see on these caterpillars, they associate that caterpillar with a bad taste, so it allows them to avoid eating that particular caterpillar again. So that's considered associative learning. Now, there's two different types of associated learning. One of them is called classical conditioning, and this is going to be a type of associated learning in which a stimulus is associated with some sort of reward or punishment. Now, there's lots of different examples of classical conditioning, but probably one of the most famous examples is the dog of Pavlov. Now, Pavlov performed an experiment where he actually conditioned a dog to salivate when he rings a bell. Now, the reason the dog would salivate is because the bell was associated with the idea of being fed. Now, the other type of associative learning is something called operant conditioning. And this is going to be a type of associated learning in which an animal learns to associate one of its behaviors with a reward or with a punishment. And sometimes what they will do is they will refer to this as a trial and error type of learning. Now, a really good example of this operant conditioning or trial and error learning is going to be the experiment that was performed by B.F. Skinner. Now, what B.F. Skinner did is he actually put a mouse or a rat inside of a box, and that box actually had a couple of levers. And because of trial and error, what the mouse would do is it would actually push down a lever to get food. And eventually, over a period of time, it figured out which lever that it needed to push. Now, another word that we need to also refer to when it comes down to the idea of learning is something called cognition. Now, cognition is a little bit different from what we've talked about because it's going to be a process of knowing that may include an awareness, a reasoning aspect, recollection, and then possibly judgment on the part of that animal. Now, a good example of cognition is going to be honeybees, for example. What you can do with honeybees is you can actually expose these insects to maybe various colors, maybe various patterns, and what they can do is they can actually distinguish between different colors and they can distinguish between the patterns. Now again, it's all based on the reward that these animals receive at the very end, but again, this is a good idea of distinguishing same from different. Now another type of learning we need to look at is something called problem solving. And this is going to be the process of devising some sort of strategy to overcome an obstacle of some sort. And a really good example of this would be chimpanzees. So what you can do with chimpanzees is you can actually put food in their environment where it's really hard to get at, but if you give them a set of boxes in their environment, what they can do is they can actually figure out or problem solve that they need to stack the boxes to be able to reach the food. So this is a good example of a problem solving type of learning. Now, the very last thing that I'm going to throw in here really quick before we finish up is a little bit of information on mating behavior and mate choice. So this type of behavior is going to primarily look at the seeking or attracting of mates, maybe choosing among potential mates, and then of course maybe competing for mates. Now, mating behavior itself is going to result from a type of natural selection called sexual selection. And in many species, mating is going to be considered promiscuous. And so what we're going to look at here is different categories of mating behavior. So if you're considered an animal that is considered promiscuous, basically you're a group of animals that really does not form any strong pair bonds or lasting relationships within that group of animals. Now, if you are a group of animals that are considered monogamous, then these types of animals actually have one male that's going to mate with one female, and they don't tend to change mates. In other words, once they have established this sort of relationship, it does tend to last for a very long time. Males and females of these types of animals tend to have very similar external morphologies. In other words, you really can't tell the difference between the males and the females. Now, in a polygamous type of relationship, this one's going to be a little bit different because this is going to be an individual of one sex that's going to mate with several individuals of the other sex. So in this case, the males and females are sexually dimorphic. What that means is simply that you can easily tell the difference between the males and the females. Now, polygamous relationships can either be polygynous or polyandrous. Now, for polygyny, this is going to be where you actually have one male that's going to mate with many females. And this tends to be the norm. The polyandry, on the other hand, tends to be one that's a little bit less likely to occur, but it does occur in some animals. And this is going to be where one female actually mates with many males. Alrighty, so that's going to finish up our screencast for Chapter 51, and as always, please make sure that you have completed your screencast study guide.